The dining room was thick with the scent of expensive wine and the suffocating silence of my humiliation. My fiancé, Richard, didn't even look up from his steak as he delivered the blow that shattered our 7-year engagement in front of my own colleagues. Jennifer's career is essentially high-level housekeeping. He chuckled, his eyes glinting with a cruelty I had spent years making excuses for. When I stood up my chair, scraping harshly against the marble floor, he didn't apologize. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms with a smirk that felt like a physical slap. "Go ahead," he sneered, his voice dropping to a terrifying, ice-cold whisper. "Go wherever you want, you'll come crawling back to apologize, because without my logic to guide you, you don't even know how to survive." He expected tears. He expected me to beg for his approval as I always had. But in that moment, something inside me didn't just break, it crystallized. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply walked out of that restaurant and straight into a life he never saw coming. What Richard didn't realize was that I wasn't his assistant. I was the invisible scaffolding holding his entire world together. By the time I moved 3 states away and stepped into a corner office, he could only dream of the cracks in his perfect life were already turning into canyons. Stay tuned, because today I'm sharing the true story of how a strategic disappearance turned into the ultimate power move. You're about to witness a series of shocking twists that prove the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting, it's the one who knows exactly when to stop saving you. By the end of this video, you'll see the exact moment the hunter became the prey. My name is Jennifer, and at 37 years old, I had spent over a decade perfecting the art of being indispensable while remaining invisible. As a senior project manager for a high-stakes construction firm, I was the woman who turned chaotic blueprints into soaring skyscrapers, yet, in my personal life, I was living in a structure that was slowly collapsing around me. I had spent 7 years with Richard, a man whose brilliance was only matched by his profound ability to make me feel small in the very world I helped him build. The night everything ended didn't start with a scream. It started with the clinking of crystal and the soft murmur of professional chatter. We were at an upscale bistro hosting a dinner for my senior partners to celebrate a milestone on a project I had navigated through months of bureaucratic nightmares. Richard, a corporate consultant who prided himself on his analytical mind, sat at the head of the table like a king presiding over a court he didn't own. The conversation had turned to the complexities of my latest build when Richard let out a soft, patronizing chuckle that cut through the air like a blade. He didn't even look at me as he addressed my boss. He just smiled that thin, practiced smile and said that while my work was cute, it was essentially high-level housekeeping with a better title. He told the table that I was a glorified secretary who just happened to wear a hard hat and that my real talent lay in making sure his life ran smoothly enough for him to do the real thinking. The table went dead. My colleagues looked at their plates, the air thick with the kind of secondhand embarrassment that makes your skin crawl. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I didn't let it reach my face. I looked at Richard, really looked at him, and saw the smug satisfaction in his eyes. He thought he was putting me in my place. He thought that by diminishing me in front of the people I respected, he was ensuring I would never have the confidence to stand without him. When I stood up, pushing my chair back with a slow, deliberate scrape, he didn't look worried. He leaned back, crossing his arms, and whispered with an ice-cold smirk that I should go ahead and walk out because I'd only end up crawling back to apologize when I realized I didn't know how to survive without his logic to guide me. In that cinematic moment of silence, I felt a strange, crystalline clarity. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I reached down, slowly unthreaded the 3-carat diamond ring from my finger. A ring he reminded me the cost of every single month, and placed it precisely into the center of his Caesar salad. The dressing smeared against the platinum band. I looked him in the eye and told him he was right. I should go exactly where I wanted, and I was starting right now. I walked out of that restaurant with my head held high, leaving the bill, the ring, and the man behind me. Driving home, my mind raced through the architecture of control he had built around us. Richard never raised a hand to me. He was far too logical for that. Instead, he had optimized me. He had chosen our mid-century modern home because it suited his aesthetic, managed our joint investments because he claimed I lacked the mathematical rigor for finance, and gaslit me into believing my professional skills were better suited for organizing his sock drawer than managing multi-million-dollar budgets. He had curated my life until I was just another piece of furniture in his pristine world. Every decision I made had to pass through the filter of his approval, and for years I had mistaken his suffocation for protection. I realized then that I wasn't being loved, I was being managed. When I arrived at the house, I didn't succumb to a breakdown. I was a project manager and I had a relocation to execute. I spent the next 4 hours moving with clinical precision. I didn't touch his things. I packed my clothes, my books, and the few pieces of art I had bought with my own bonuses. I didn't leave a mess. I left a void. After my bags were in the car, I sat down at the mahogany desk in the den and opened my laptop. I spent an hour finishing a final flawless handover for my current project at work, ensuring that my professional reputation remained untarnished even as I prepared to vanish. The silence of the house was heavy, but it wasn't lonely. It was the sound of a professional closing a file on a failed venture. Before I walked out the door for the last time, I placed my house keys on the marble kitchen island. Next to them, I left a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a letter of heartbreak or a list of grievances. It was a typed document containing the master passwords for the household accounts, the schedule for the gardener, and the contact information for the private banker I had been dealing with on his behalf for years. I didn't owe him an explanation, but I wanted him to see in black and white exactly how much of his flawless life had been maintained by the woman he called a secretary. I stepped into the cool night air and locked the door behind me, knowing that the man inside would soon find out that logic is useless when you've lost the person who gave it a foundation to stand on. What he mistook for a temporary tantrum was actually the final second of my life as his shadow. As the taillights of my car faded into the darkness of the suburban streets I once called home, I felt a weight lifting that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I didn't head for a friend's couch or a local hotel where Richard could easily find me and exert his practiced brand of psychological pressure. Instead, I drove toward a future I had been quietly financing for 3 years. I called it my opportunity fund, a modest percentage of every bonus and commission I had earned tucked away in a private account Richard didn't even know existed. He had always assumed I spent my extra earnings on the high-end decor and designer clothes he insisted I wear to match his brand. He never imagined I was actually buying my freedom. I had already secured a position in Seattle, a senior project manager role at a premier global firm that had headhunted me months ago. At the time, I had turned them down to stay by Richard's side, but a single phone call at midnight changed everything. They didn't care about my personal drama. They cared about my track record of bringing in massive projects under budget. Within 48 hours of leaving that restaurant, I was signing a lease on a corporate apartment that felt like a sanctuary. My new home was the antithesis of the life I left behind. Richard's house had been a museum of his ego filled with heavy velvet curtains, dark mahogany, and statement pieces that required constant dusting and a specific rigid way of living. My new space was minimalist, bathed in the soft gray light of the Pacific Northwest, and filled with a silence that felt like a luxury. There were no schedules to maintain for anyone but myself, no critiques on how I made my coffee, and no logical explanations for why my preferences were inferior to his. For the first few days, I found myself holding my breath, waiting for a criticism that never came. The sensory relief was overwhelming. I could finally hear my own thoughts again, and they were telling me that I was not just surviving, I was ascending. I was a high-value woman who had been operating at half capacity to keep a smaller man comfortable, and now the governor was off the engine. While I flourished in my professional life, I implemented a strict digital blackout to manage the ghost of my past. I knew Richard's playbook. He would expect a flurry of emotional texts, angry social media posts, or desperate calls in the middle of the night. A narcissist feeds on reaction, so I gave him a vacuum. I bought a new phone for my daily life and took my old device, the one linked to our 7 years of history, and buried it in the back of a kitchen drawer. I committed to checking it only once a week on Sunday afternoons, with the cold detachment of a researcher observing a specimen. I didn't block him, and I didn't delete my social media. I simply stopped existing in his digital world. No revenge selfies in my new office, no cryptic quotes about toxic people, and no breadcrumbs for him to follow. By disappearing entirely, I forced him to confront the one thing he couldn't handle, a version of reality where he was no longer the protagonist in my story. The first time I powered on that old phone, the sheer volume of notifications was staggering, but it was the content that was truly revealing. Richard's initial messages were a masterclass in condescension. He started by forgiving me for my little outburst at the restaurant, suggesting that perhaps I was just hormonal or overwhelmed by the pressure of my job. He spoke as if I were a runaway child who would surely come home once my stomach started growling. By the second week, his tone shifted to a frustrated arrogance. He left a long voicemail complaining that the dry cleaner hadn't seen me and that he was running out of his favorite silk shirts. He sounded annoyed, as if my absence was a personal inconvenience rather than a life-altering heartbreak. He was still entirely convinced that I was huddled in some dingy motel, struggling to navigate the real world without his superior intellect to chart my course. He didn't realize that while he was worried about his laundry, I was already overseeing the groundbreaking of a 40-story skyscraper and commanding a team that actually respected my expertise. His overconfidence was his blind spot, a massive structural flaw in the tower of his ego. He truly believed I was the one in a tailspin, never imagining that he was the one standing on a bridge I had already dismantled. By the end of the first month, his messages shifted from "come home" to "where is the file for the Henderson account?" And that's when I knew the cracks were forming. That mention of the Henderson account in his latest message was more than just a question. It was the first puff of smoke from a building that was quietly starting to burn. Sitting in my quiet office in Seattle, looking out at the rain-streaked windows, I finally allowed myself to look back at the mechanics of our former life, not with the eyes of a wounded partner, but with the analytical detachment of a project manager. It was in this silence that the grand revelation finally crystallized in my mind. For 7 years, Richard had convinced me and the world that he was the visionary, the architect of a flawless professional existence, and the master of pure cold logic. But as I mentally audited our time together, I realized that Richard wasn't the architect. He was merely the figurehead. I was the ghost in his system. I wasn't just supporting him, I was operating him. Every high-stakes email he sent had been subtly rewritten by me to soften his abrasive edges. Every business proposal he touted as a masterstroke of reasoning had actually been passed through my hands for invisible editing, where I quietly corrected his flawed data and tightened his circular arguments. I had managed the delicate social diplomacy with his clients, smoothing over the feathers he ruffled with his arrogance, and making sure the people he insulted still felt valued enough to sign his contracts. Without me there to translate his narcissism into professional confidence, Richard's persona was beginning to fray at the seams. He had spent years telling me I was lucky to be in the orbit of his genius, never realizing that his genius was a curated product of my labor. The true comedy of the situation began when I heard through the grapevine that Richard had gone on a hiring spree to fill the administrative gap I had left behind. In his mind, I was replaceable with enough cash and a prestigious job title. He hired a top-tier executive assistant from a Fortune 500 firm and a high-priced management consultant to handle his strategy, paying them triple what he had ever valued my contributions at. But as the weeks went by, it became clear that they were failing him in ways he couldn't comprehend. They were professionals, and they did exactly what he told them to do. They followed his instructions to the letter and executed his logical plans without question. What Richard didn't understand, and what his new staff couldn't provide, was the deep, intuitive emotional intelligence that I had used to shield him from himself. I knew when a client was losing interest before they even said a word. I knew which technical errors in his spreadsheets were the result of his overconfidence, and I fixed them before they became public embarrassments. His new team lacked that unique EQ, They didn't anticipate his needs or catch his blind spots because they viewed him as a boss, not a project to be managed. Richard was finally getting exactly what he asked for, a world where his word was law and no one interfered with his vision, and it was destroying him. He was discovering that a man who demands total control is often the last person who should have it. The fallout was a slow-motion train wreck that I watched from the safety of 1,000 miles away. Reports began to trickle in from mutual acquaintances and old colleagues who didn't know the full story but knew something was desperately wrong at Richard's firm. The company was suddenly under a grueling internal review. For 5 years, I had been the one to catch a specific recurring compliance error that Richard's logical mind insisted was correct, but was actually a massive regulatory red flag. Every quarter, I had quietly moved numbers, updated filings, and ensured that the legal department stayed satisfied, all while letting Richard believe his filings were perfect. Without my silent intervention, that error had finally made its way to the top. His flawless logic had resulted in a catastrophic blunder that threatened his licenses and his reputation. The partners were furious, and the clients he had spent years patronizing were no longer willing to tolerate his attitude now that his work was proving to be hollow. I sat in my new apartment sipping tea in the stillness and realized that I hadn't just walked away from a relationship. I had withdrawn the entire safety net that prevented a mediocre man from falling into the depths of his own incompetence. I had been the one holding the structural beams in place while he took credit for the view from the top floor. He thought I was the one who needed a map, but he was the one who didn't realize I had been the compass all along. The news of Richard's impending professional ruin reached me like a distant thunderclap, but the direct strike didn't happen until a Tuesday night shortly after midnight. I was sitting on my balcony in Seattle watching the city lights reflect off the dark water when the old phone I kept in the drawer began to vibrate with a frantic, rhythmic persistence. I didn't rush to answer it. I let it buzz against the wood for a long moment, savoring the silence of my own life before crossing the room. When I finally picked it up, there was no smug greeting, no condescending lecture, and no ice-cold smirk. Instead, I heard the sound of a man who had finally hit the bottom of his own delusion. Richard's voice was a jagged mess of unpolished panic and desperate speed. He was rambling about the Henderson account, about a regulatory board investigation, and about a potential lawsuit that could strip him of his license and everything he owned. For the first time in 7 years, he didn't sound like a master of logic. He sounded like a drowning man grasping at shadows. He started the conversation by trying to order me, snapping that I needed to tell him exactly where the backup compliance spreadsheets were kept and how I had hidden the data from his new team. When I didn't respond, his voice cracked, pivoting sharply from a command to a plea. He begged me to log into the old server to fix the filing before the morning deadline to save him from a disaster that was entirely of his own making. He was revealing his absolute pathetic dependency on the woman he had once called a secretary, and the irony was as thick as the midnight air. I listened to him spiral for 5 minutes without interrupting. I heard him blame the new staff, blame the board, and even try to blame the software, all while his breathing became more labored. I waited until he finally ran out of breath, until the only sound left was the frantic static of his fear. When I spoke, I didn't use the voice of a jilted lover or a woman seeking vengeance. I used my project manager voice, the clinical, detached, and authoritative tone I used to de-escalate crisis situations on multi-million-dollar construction sites. I told him quite calmly that there was no secret spreadsheet and no hidden data. I explained that for 5 years, I had been the one manually reconstructing his flawed logic and correcting his errors before they reached the eyes of the regulators. I sat there in my dark living room and delivered the cold truth that I had known for years, but had been too kind to say. I told him that he didn't lose a wife or a fiancé when I walked out of that restaurant. He lost the person who made people believe he was smarter than he actually was. I told him that his entire professional reputation was a house of cards that I had been quietly gluing together behind the scenes, and now that I had stopped, it was simply returning to its natural state of collapse. It was the ultimate slap in the face, delivered not with heat, but with the freezing precision of a final audit. The silence that followed was heavy, but it didn't last. Richard, ever the narcissist, tried to pivot into a logic trap. He tried to use our past history as a weapon, guilt-tripping me by saying that if his firm went under, my own reputation would be tarnished because we were partners in everything. He claimed that I had a moral obligation to protect the life we had built together, suggesting that my lack of loyalty was the real reason for his current failure. But I wasn't the woman I was 6 months ago. I pointed out the legal and professional reality that he had worked so hard to establish. He had spent years insisting that I was merely an assistant, a helper, who had no real stake or authority in his business. I reminded him that on paper, and by his own frequent admission to our peers, I was nothing more than a ghost in his machine. I told him that I was no longer his employee, no longer his fiancé, and certainly no longer his safety net. If he wanted my professional consulting services to fix the catastrophe he had created, he would have to admit out loud for the record that he was utterly incapable of functioning without me. I demanded he say the words he had spent a decade suppressing, that his genius was a fraud and that he was drowning because he had never learned how to swim without me holding his head above water. The silence on the other end of the line this time was different. It was the sound of an ego finally dying, the sound of a man realizing that he had zero leverage over a woman who wanted absolutely nothing from him. He couldn't threaten my finances because I had my own. He couldn't threaten my career because I had surpassed his. And he couldn't threaten my heart because he had already burned that bridge to ash. I could hear his shallow, ragged breathing, the sound of a man who had run out of lies and was finally facing the terrifying reality of his own mediocrity. He had spent years predicting that I would be the one crawling back to him, begging for a scrap of his approval. He had spent years telling me that the world was too cold for a woman like me to navigate without his superior intellect to guide the way. But as I hung up the phone and set it back on the counter, the truth was laid bare in the darkness of my apartment. For the first time in 10 years, the man who predicted I would crawl back was the one gasping for air on the other end of the line. After hanging up on Richard's frantic gasping, I didn't just go back to sleep. I realized that the panic in his voice wasn't just about a missed deadline. It was the sound of a predator who had finally run out of prey. During my months of quiet reflection in Seattle, I hadn't just been building a new career. I had been conducting a forensic audit of Richard's entire history. I had always wondered why a man with his supposed brilliance had so little to show for the years before I met him, and why his previous long-term partner, Sarah, had vanished so abruptly from his life. I decided to reach out to her, and what I discovered was the true super twist of Richard's existence. Sarah wasn't just an ex. She was the architect of his first firm, the woman whose research and late-night labor had launched his reputation only for him to discard her the moment she asked to be named a partner. Talking to Sarah was like looking into a mirror of my own past. We discovered a chilling, calculated pattern. Richard didn't just date women. He harvested them. He targeted high-achieving, empathetic women whose brilliance he could siphon off to fuel his own professional ascent. He would absorb our skills, take credit for our insights, and the moment we began to realize our own value, he would use gaslighting and humiliation to keep us small. This realization transformed my journey from a personal escape into a collective victory. I wasn't just running for myself anymore. I was standing for every woman Richard had ever used as a stepping stone. This newfound sisterhood gave me a sense of purpose that no corner office ever could. I realized that my success was the ultimate evidence of his fraud, and together with Sarah, I was making sure that the paper trail of his incompetence was finally reaching the people who mattered. Richard, sensing that his professional world was officially turning to ash, attempted one last desperate mercy mission. He drove across state lines nearly 1,000 miles to find me. He didn't come with the humility of a changed man. He came with the tools of a negotiator. He tracked me down to a public plaza near my new office, a beautiful open space filled with professionals and the vibrant energy of the city. He looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and the arrogant smirk was replaced by a hollow, forced smile. He was holding a massive bouquet of lilies, my favorite flowers, and a leather-bound folder. He didn't apologize for the dinner or the 7 years of psychological erosion or the cold prediction that I would crawl back. Instead, he presented me with a revised marriage contract and a legal partnership agreement for his struggling firm. It was a transactional apology, a business deal disguised as a romantic gesture. He told me he had realized we were better as a team and that he was willing to give me 49% of the company if I would just come back and fix the compliance disaster. I stood there looking radiant in my charcoal power suit, feeling the cool breeze of the Pacific Northwest on my face, and I didn't even reach for the flowers. I looked at the man who had once been my entire world and felt absolutely nothing but a faint sense of pity. I didn't take the folder he offered. Instead, I reached into my own bag and pulled out a simple white envelope. Inside wasn't a counteroffer or a list of demands. It was a document containing the contact information for Sarah's lawyer and a copy of the formal complaint we had jointly filed with the regulatory board regarding his historical patterns of professional plagiarism and ethical violations. I watched the blood drain from his face as he realized that the quiet woman he thought he had broken had actually spent her time building a fortress he couldn't penetrate. I told him quite clearly that he wasn't there because he loved me or because he was sorry for the pain he caused. I told him he was there because he was a mediocre man who had finally been caught, and he was terrified of a world where he had to stand on his own merits. I told him that I was no longer a project for him to manage or a resource for him to exploit. I was the person who had finally finished the handover of his true self back to him, and the reality was clearly more than he could handle. I watched as he looked around the busy plaza, realizing that even his grand cinematic gesture of driving across the country was just another attempt at control that I had seen through instantly. He tried to speak, tried to find one last logical argument to trap me, but there was nothing left. I delivered my final rejection with the calm dignity of a woman who had already won. I told him that our relationship hadn't been a partnership. It had been a long-term loan of my intelligence that he had defaulted on. I turned my back on him while he was still standing there with those dying lilies, the heavy weight of his revised contract still in his hands. I walked back toward my office, toward my life, and toward a future where my name would be on the door, not just in the fine print of someone else's success. As I walked away, I knew that the silence behind me was the sound of his world finally going quiet. He had spent years convinced that he was the one holding the keys to my survival, never imagining that the moment I walked away would be the moment he finally realized he was locked in a prison of his own making. He had nothing left to offer me but words, and I had finally learned that words without character are just noise. The apology he demanded from me on that final night was the only thing he had left to offer, and it was the only thing I no longer needed. The heavy glass doors of my office building swung shut behind me, effectively muffining the sound of Richard's world as it finally fell silent. I didn't look back to see him standing in that plaza with his useless contracts and his wilting lilies, because for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't responsible for his reaction. I walked into the crisp Seattle air, and for a moment, I just stood there breathing in the scent of rain and cedar, realizing that the terrifying freedom I had chased for months had finally become my permanent reality. My life now is a testament to a different kind of success, not the kind defined by the person standing next to you, but the kind found in the quiet corners of your own soul. It isn't about finding a new man to prove my worth, nor is it solely about the high-paying job, though my recent promotion to Director of Operations was a victory I tasted with pure, unadulterated joy, because I earned it on my own merits without anyone optimizing my efforts. My victory is found in the small sacred joys of a reclaimed existence. It is in the Saturday mornings spent in my small terrace garden, my hands deep in the cool soil as I plant perennials that will bloom long after this chapter of my life is a distant memory. It is in the absence of that tightening in my chest when my phone rings the disappearance of that instinctive flinch as I prepare for a critique that never comes. I have achieved what I now call financial and emotional sovereignty, the absolute right to govern my own heart and my own bank account without seeking permission from a man who once tried to convince me I was incapable of both. There is a profound humming peace in knowing that my life is no longer a performance, staged for a narcissist's approval. I have learned that the most luxurious thing a woman can own is her own time in the quiet of her own mind. As for Richard, the news of his aftermath reached me through a final formal letter from Sarah's legal team, and it was perhaps the most fitting conclusion I could have imagined. He didn't go to jail, and he didn't experience a sudden cinematic explosion of ruin. Instead, he suffered the one fate he feared more than death. He became irrelevant. After the regulatory board finished their review, his prestigious firm didn't just stumble. It evaporated. The partners he had spent years patronizing moved on to firms that actually delivered results, and the clients who once humored his arrogance suddenly found his logic to be a liability. He moved to a much smaller town 3 states away, a place where no one knew the name Richard Vance. From what I hear, he still frequents a local bar there, telling anyone who will listen, usually the bartender or a stray traveler, about the great empire he once built and the woman he made from nothing. He still clings to the lie that I was a project he perfected, but the tragedy for him is that no one believes him anymore. His punishment is to live out his days as a small, unremarkable man with no one left to gaslight. He is a ghost, haunting his own stories, trapped in a past that everyone else has moved on from. He lost his stage, he lost his audience, and most importantly, he lost the woman who was the true source of the light he tried to claim as his own. He is finally standing on his own 2 feet, and he is finding that without a woman to hold him up, he is much shorter than he ever realized. I want to take a moment now to speak directly to you, the woman who might be listening to this and feeling a familiar weight in your own chest. Perhaps you are 37 like I was, or perhaps you are 55, 65, or 70, and you feel that the structure of your life is too heavy to leave behind. We are often taught that loyalty is a virtue above all others, but I am here to tell you that loyalty to a person who demands your diminishment is not a virtue. It is a slow suicide of the spirit. The greatest revenge you will ever take is not making him suffer, and it is not shouting your truth from the rooftops until he finally admits he was wrong. He will likely never admit he was wrong. The greatest revenge is thriving so completely, so deeply, and so quietly that his opinion of you no longer carries a single ounce of weight in your world. It is the moment you realize that his voice, which once sounded like thunder, has become nothing more than background noise you no longer bother to tune into. Whether you are starting over at 20 or 80, it is never ever too late to stop being the scaffolding for someone else's ego. You were not born to be the invisible support beam for a man who refuses to see your value. You were born to be the architect of your own joy. Walking away didn't make me a failure. It made me the master of my own blueprints. I spent 7 years building a world for Richard only to realize that I was the one with the tools all along. If you are waiting for a sign or for an apology or for him to finally recognize everything you do, please stop waiting. He sees what you do. He just doesn't want you to know how much he needs it. The power shift happens the moment you realize that you don't need him to recognize your value. You only need to recognize it yourself. I look at my life now at the peaceful Seattle skyline and the thriving garden on my balcony, and I am grateful for that cold smirk in the restaurant. It was the last gift he ever gave me the moment he finally pushed me far enough to realize I could fly. So if you've ever been told you'd crawl back, ask yourself, is he afraid you'll leave, or is he afraid he'll finally have to stand on his own 2 feet? The heavy glass doors of my office building swung shut behind me, effectively muffling the sound of Richard's world as it finally fell silent. I didn't look back to see him standing in that plaza with his useless contracts and his wilting lilies because for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't responsible for his reaction. My life now is a testament to a different kind of success found in the quiet corners of my own soul, marked by the absence of anxiety when the phone rings and the joy of a promotion earned on my own merits. As for Richard, he became irrelevant, moving to a small town where he tells anyone who will listen that he made me, but no one believes him anymore. He is finally standing on his own 2 feet, and he is finding that without a woman to hold him up, he is much shorter than he ever realized. Walking away didn't make me a failure. It made me the master of my own blueprints. If you found Jennifer's journey toward emotional sovereignty empowering, please subscribe to our channel to hear more stories of resilience. We believe the wisdom in this community is our greatest strength, so please share your thoughts in the comments about the moment you realized your own value. Your stories of standing tall help others find the courage to do the same. If you've ever been told you'd crawl back, ask yourself, is he afraid you'll leave? Or is he afraid he'll finally have to stand on his own 2 feet?